1, 2, get down. Get down. 2, 1, 2, get down.
What is the deal, beautiful people? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Ramon. Here we talk about any and everything photography. Today's topic is a rather boring but a super interesting one, and it's a very personal experience for myself that I would like to share with you. And we're talking about dials, physical, actual dials on the front of the camera. So on the camera period, not just the front. When I started my journey to take photography seriously, my camera of choice was the SONY NEX5T. And what an amazing little camera. There are a few things about it that I have since come to understand that that I forgive a lot of its shortcomings. And let's be for real here. This camera is no slouch. This camera produces amazing results, so much so that I can line this up against any of my Micro Four Thirds cameras or any of my full frame cameras, and it will perform. It's an APS-C, so it's smack that in the middle. So it's essentially the same sensor as something you would find in the A6000, except in a much smaller, more consumer friendly package. And this started the downfall. The NEX really served its purpose in it was small, it was light, and it had a very techie, gadgety feel to it, which I quite enjoy. I mean, I can't remember when this camera first came out, but it's an old camera, and this thing had Wi-Fi on it, had Bluetooth, had NFC. Like, this had NFC before my phone had NFC, and like 2 or 3 years before that. So there's a lot to be said, and there's a lot that was packed into here, and there's a ton of like Sony's proprietary, now we can call them algorithms. At the time, it was just their secret sauce on how it detected scenes and portraits versus landscapes, like versus macro. That stuff was well done. The autofocus was amazing. It was a great tool to get me out there and shooting. However, when I started to take it a little more seriously, when I started to embark on the journey of learning the exposure triangle, learning how manual mode works, no longer relying on the camera to give me the best settings, because I then sort of understood, okay, here's the image that I see in my mind. I can't let the camera control that, because the camera might give me something totally different, right? I may want to freeze a scene, but the camera decided to expose in quite the opposite. So it's got a very well lit screen, but at the expense of shutter. So the subject may be blurry. Maybe I wanted it to be frozen. It's super sharp. So manual was the way to go for me. However, on this camera, there's only one physical dial. And what's interesting about that is the exposure triangle is 3 very important pieces. And for me, learning manual on this camera took longer than it should have. And I remember many days being on the phone with Jerry, who I consider to be my mentor, and he's just like asking silly ass questions like, yeah, but I don't understand. And you know, years later, when I picked up the NEX again, I started to realize, holy shit, the reason I didn't understand these things is because I was confused by the menus, because it's such a menu driven camera. At the lack of buttons, you're forced to dial into or jump into the menus to change certain things. And it took longer than it needed to. When I upgraded to the A7 II, things became different, right? There's now a dial for shutter, there's a dial for aperture, there's a button for ISO. Like, whoa, this is different. And my understanding of the dance of the 3 dials and the exposure triangle sort of just clicked. And then later, much later, I got my hands on my Fuji X-T2. Holy shit, there's a physical button and dial for everything. The ISO has a dial, the aperture has a dial, the shutter has a dial. Like it was just a beautiful experience. And now I can come back and tell you with all sincerity, I am no longer interested in recommending cameras to people that lack buttons, because I think it will prolong their understanding of the exposure triangle. I think it will prolong them really growing into something that they can, when they're ready to take it more seriously, they can. And I don't know, it's just something about having dials. And to be honest, I'm still to this day a little confused when I go back, right? And this is me now, a well-seasoned photographer. I understand a lot more things about our craft and the technicalities behind it. Going back to use the NEX with the lack of dials is still a painful experience for me today. So much so that I just put this thing on auto. That is unheard of for me. Usually I will leave it on aperture priority, but I just leave it on auto, man. It's just like, I don't want to deal with it. And it does produce the images I want. So the NEX has now, because I've got a 16 millimeter on there, which is equivalent to a 24, it's become my secondary camera. So it's super small enough that it will just go in my pocket. And if I want to capture something wide for whatever reason, I'll just take it out and boom, 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 capture it, and I'm out of there. But yeah, the importance of having physical dials, and I'm not championing for something like a Fuji, because a Fuji is the extreme of that, and it's a good extreme, right? But that can be difficult to learn too, because it's almost overwhelming how many buttons you have on a Fuji and dials. But you know, I think the Sony, the A7 line does a good job with the design. I think the Olympus does a good job. Panasonic's do a good job. So I'm gonna shift my recommendations from like the Sony A6000 line. I would now recommend something better with more dials for beginners. And I'm curious to see how you guys think of what you guys think about that. Have you ever been, or do you think your growth as a photographer was stunted by the lack of dials? I know it's such an interesting question. Hopefully you liked the video. Hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. Plenty more content coming. My name is Ramon. I'm out of here.
Get down.
Peace.